The bright screen of James Miller's phone lit up his tired face as another ride request came through. The clock on his dashboard showed 11:45 p.m., and he had been driving his yellow taxi through Boston's busy streets for almost 12 hours. The 52-year-old taxi driver rubbed his eyes and let out a long sigh when he saw the pickup location, Boston Memorial Hospital. Just great, he muttered to himself, adjusting his worn baseball cap. Another trip to that part of town. James had been driving taxis for 23 years, and over time, he had developed what he called his street smarts, though these were really just his prejudices wrapped in self-justification. The autumn night was chilly, and a light drizzle tapped against his windshield as he navigated through the city's quieting streets. The radio played soft jazz, but James wasn't listening. His mind was already making assumptions about his next passenger. The hospital was in what he considered the wrong side of town, an area where many African-American families lived. As he turned onto the hospital street, James noticed groups of nurses changing shifts, their scrubs visible under their warm jackets. The emergency room entrance was busy as usual, its bright lights creating a pool of artificial daylight in the dark night. He pulled up to the main entrance, where the ride request had originated. James kept his doors locked, a habit he was particularly strict about in this neighborhood. Through his rearview mirror, he carefully watched the hospital entrance. His weathered face, lined with years of city driving and hard living, reflected his growing impatience. Come on, he mumbled, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. I ain't got all night. The fare meter wasn't running yet, but James was already calculating how much money he was losing by waiting. He had planned to head home after this ride, to his small apartment where his TV dinner and favorite late-night show awaited. A few people walked past his taxi, a young nurse pushing an elderly patient in a wheelchair, a worried-looking family clutching paper bags of belongings, and a janitor emptying trash bins. None of them were his passenger. James was about to cancel the ride when he noticed a tall figure walking purposefully toward his taxi. The man was African-American, wearing light blue scrubs under a black jacket. He carried a professional-looking briefcase in one hand and had a stethoscope hanging around his neck. Despite his professional appearance, James's prejudices immediately kicked in. He quickly checked that his doors were still locked and that his wallet was secure in his front pocket, behaviors that had become automatic for him in similar situations. The man approached the taxi's back door and gave it a gentle pull, finding it locked. He looked directly at James through the window, his expression neutral but tired. James hesitated for a moment, his finger hovering over the door lock button. In his mind, he was already crafting excuses about why he couldn't take this fare. His shift was ending, he had another pickup, the taxi was having problems. But something made him pause. Maybe it was the hospital ID badge clearly visible on the man's jacket, or perhaps it was the professional way he carried himself. Whatever the reason, James reluctantly pressed the button to unlock the doors. The soft click seemed unusually loud in the quiet car. The back door opened, bringing with it a rush of cool night air and the distant sounds of the hospital's emergency room. The man slid into the back seat, placing his briefcase carefully beside him. The interior light illuminated his face briefly. He appeared to be in his early 40s, with kind eyes that showed signs of exhaustion. "Good evening," the passenger said politely, his voice deep and well-educated. "Could you take me to 47 Maple Street, please? It's in the Beacon Hill area." James's eyebrows rose slightly at the mention of the upscale neighborhood. He turned around in his seat, studying his passenger with poorly concealed suspicion. The meter started running with a soft click, and James pulled away from the hospital entrance, his mind already filling with assumptions and prejudices that would soon be challenged in ways he never expected. The taxi emerged into the late-night traffic, its yellow paint gleaming under the street lights, carrying both men toward an encounter that would change at least one of their lives forever. The taxi moved smoothly through Boston's streets, passing under the yellow glow of streetlights. James kept glancing at his rearview mirror, watching his passenger who was now quietly looking at some papers from his briefcase. The silence in the car made James uncomfortable. He was used to filling quiet moments with conversation, even if it wasn't always welcome. "So, rough night at the hospital, huh?" James asked, his tone carrying a hint of mockery. "Must be tough working there. Cleaning up and all that." He emphasized the word cleaning, making his assumption clear about what job he thought his passenger held. Dr. Marcus Thompson looked up from his papers, catching James's eyes in the mirror. He had dealt with such assumptions throughout his career, and his response was calm and measured. "The hospital is always busy," he said simply, returning to his documents. James wasn't satisfied with the short answer. His prejudices pushed him to continue. "Yeah, I bet. Must be real different from what you're used to, being in such a fancy hospital and all." He chuckled, adding, "Don't see many of your kind in there, except maybe cleaning staff or security guards." The paper in Dr. Thompson's hands was actually a complex surgical report from a heart operation he had performed earlier that day. He had just spent 12 hours saving a patient's life, but here he was, being judged by someone who couldn't see past the color of his skin. "You seem very interested in hospital work," Dr. Thompson said politely. "Do you have family in healthcare?" His voice remained professional and controlled, though his eyes showed a mix of tiredness and disappointment at facing such prejudice yet again. James snorted. "Nah, my people actually went to college, got real jobs." He emphasized the word real, making his implications crystal clear. The taxi stopped at a red light, and James continued, "Must be nice, though, getting those affirmative action benefits. Making good money pushing a mop around." Dr. Thompson straightened in his seat. 20 years of medical practice, countless lives saved, and numerous medical awards hung on his office walls, yet here he was, being reduced to stereotypes by a prejudiced taxi driver. He considered ending the ride early but decided to remain calm and dignified. "You know," Dr. Thompson began, his voice steady, "assumptions can be dangerous things. They limit our understanding of people and situations." He placed his surgical reports back in his briefcase, next to the medical journal that featured his latest research on innovative cardiac procedures. James barely listened to the wisdom in those words. Instead, he continued his inappropriate comments as they turned onto Commonwealth Avenue. "This sure is a fancy address you're heading to. Must be going to clean somebody's house this late, huh?" He laughed at his own joke, not noticing how his passenger's expression had changed from tired to concerned. Dr. Thompson had noticed something James hadn't. The slight tremor in the driver's left hand, the small beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning, and the occasional sharp intake of breath. As a cardiac surgeon, these signs sent immediate warning signals to his trained mind. "Sir," Dr. Thompson said, leaning forward slightly, "are you feeling all right? You seem to be showing some concerning symptoms." "I'm fine," James snapped, but his voice wavered slightly. "Don't need your kind worried about me." He gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to ignore the increasing tightness in his chest. The taxi continued through the quiet streets of Boston, its two occupants trapped in a bubble of tension. James kept making small, prejudiced comments, each one revealing more about his own ignorance than anything else. Meanwhile, Dr. Thompson maintained his composure, though his medical instincts were on high alert. Little did James know that his passenger wasn't just any man heading home after a long day. He was Dr. Marcus Thompson, chief of cardiology at Boston Memorial Hospital, with over 2 decades of experience saving lives of all colors, backgrounds, and beliefs. And in just a few minutes, James would learn this truth in the most unexpected and dramatic way possible. The night was about to take a turn that would shatter James's prejudices forever, though not in any way he could have imagined. As the taxi turned onto Beacon Street, James's breathing became more labored. His left arm felt strange, a tingling sensation that he tried to shake off. But Dr. Thompson, watching carefully from the back seat, noticed every small detail with his trained medical eye. "You spend a lot of time in Beacon Hill?" James asked, his voice now slightly strained. He was determined to continue his rude behavior despite feeling increasingly unwell. "Bet you know all the fancy houses that need cleaning, right?" He forced a laugh that ended in a slight gasp. Dr. Thompson ignored the racist comment, too focused now on the medical signs before him. James's skin had taken on a grayish color, and his breathing pattern was becoming irregular. The doctor recognized these classic symptoms immediately. They were pointing toward a severe cardiac event. "Sir, I really think we should pull over," Dr. Thompson said firmly. "You're showing clear signs off." "Don't tell me what to do," James interrupted, but his voice was weaker now. Sweat ran down his forehead, and his grip on the steering wheel had become unsteady. "I've been driving these streets longer than you've been." He couldn't finish his sentence as a sharp pain shot through his chest. The taxi began to drift slightly into the next lane. A car honked loudly as it passed them. Dr. Thompson leaned forward, his professional instincts taking over completely. "Pull over immediately," he commanded in his authoritative surgeon's voice. "You're having a heart attack." James wanted to argue, to make another racist comment, but the pain in his chest had become unbearable. His left arm felt like it was on fire, and black spots danced in his vision. With the last bit of his consciousness, he managed to guide the taxi to the curb, nearly hitting a parked car in the process. As soon as the taxi stopped, Dr. Thompson sprung into action. He quickly got out and opened the driver's door. James was slumped over the steering wheel, his face contorted in pain. His skin was clammy and pale, classic symptoms that Dr. Thompson had seen countless times in his operating room. I can't," James gasped, clutching his chest. The pain was like nothing he had ever experienced before, worse than when he broke his leg in high school, worse than any injury he'd ever had. "Listen to me carefully," Dr. Thompson said, his voice calm but commanding as he helped James into a better position. "I am Dr. Marcus Thompson, Chief of Cardiology at Boston Memorial Hospital. I'm going to help you, but you need to trust me right now." James's eyes widened in shock, both from the pain and the revelation. The man he had been mocking all night was a doctor, not just any doctor, but a chief of cardiology. He tried to speak, but only managed a weak groan. Dr. Thompson had already pulled out his phone and called 911. "This is Dr. Marcus Thompson. I have a male patient, approximately 50 years old, experiencing an acute myocardial infarction," he reported professionally. "We're on Beacon Street, near the intersection with Arlington. I need an ambulance immediately." While keeping the emergency operator on the line, Dr. Thompson quickly loosened James's collar and tie. He pulled a small bottle of aspirin from his briefcase, something he always carried with him. "Chew this," he instructed James, placing the pill in his mouth. James could hardly believe what was happening. The man he had been treating so poorly was now possibly saving his life. Tears began to roll down his cheeks, from pain, from shame, from the shocking turn of events. "Stay with me," Dr. Thompson said firmly, checking James's pulse. "The ambulance is on its way. Keep breathing, nice and steady." His hands were sure and confident, his manner completely professional despite all the insults he had endured earlier. In the distance, sirens began to wail. James's vision was getting darker, but he could still see Dr. Thompson's face, the face he had looked at with such prejudice just minutes ago. Now it was the face of his potential savior. The night air was filled with the approaching sirens, and red and blue lights began to flash against the buildings. Dr. Thompson maintained his steady pressure on James' wrist, monitoring his pulse, while continuing to speak calmly to both James and the emergency operator. The roles had completely reversed. The man who had been subjected to racism all evening was now the only person standing between James and disaster. The ambulance arrived with its lights flashing bright against the dark Boston streets. 2 paramedics jumped out, their movements quick and practiced. They found an unusual scene, a well-dressed black man in scrubs giving medical care to a taxi driver who was barely conscious. "Patient is James Miller, 52 years old," Dr. Thompson reported professionally as the paramedics approached. "Started showing symptoms approximately 15 minutes ago. Classic signs of myocardial infarction, chest pain, left arm numbness, shortness of breath. I've given him aspirin, but his condition is deteriorating." The paramedics worked quickly, their respect for Dr. Thompson obvious as they recognized him from the hospital. They attached monitors to James's chest and started an IV line. The readings on their equipment confirmed Dr. Thompson's diagnosis. James was having a severe heart attack. "BP is dropping," one paramedic announced. "We need to move now." James was barely aware as they transferred him to the stretcher. Through his pain-filled haze, he could hear Dr. Thompson giving detailed medical instructions. The same man he had insulted all evening was now rattling off medical terms and vital signs like a true professional. "I'm coming with you," Dr. Thompson told the paramedics as they loaded James into the ambulance. "He's going to need immediate catheterization, and I'm on call tonight anyway." He climbed into the ambulance, immediately checking the cardiac monitor readings. The ambulance sped through the streets, its siren clearing a path through the late-night traffic. Inside, James drifted in and out of consciousness. In his moments of clarity, he saw Dr. Thompson working alongside the paramedics, his movements sure and confident. "Stay with us, Mr. Miller," Dr. Thompson said firmly, noticing James's eyes flutter open. "We're almost at the hospital. Your right coronary artery is likely blocked, but we're going to take care of that." Tears rolled down James's cheeks, not just from the pain now, but from the overwhelming shame. Here was the man he had mocked and belittled, working to save his life with such dedication and skill. The ambulance arrived at Boston Memorial Hospital's emergency entrance, the same entrance where, less than an hour ago, James had made such cruel assumptions about Dr. Thompson. Now a team of medical staff was waiting, alerted by Dr. Thompson's calls from the ambulance. "Get him straight to the cath lab," Dr. Thompson ordered as they rushed through the hospital corridors. "I want a full cardiac panel, and get me the angiogram results as soon as possible." The hospital staff moved with practiced efficiency, many of them greeting Dr. Thompson with obvious respect. "Yes, doctor," they responded, their actions immediate and precise. James, still conscious enough to observe, saw how everyone treated Dr. Thompson with high regard. In the preparation room, Dr. Thompson leaned over James. "Mr. Miller, we're taking you into surgery now. We need to clear the blockage in your heart. Do you understand?" James tried to speak, to apologize, but could only manage a weak nod. The pain in his chest was getting worse. "I know you're scared," Dr. Thompson said, his voice gentler now. "But I promise you, I'm going to do everything I can to help you. That's my job, and I take it very seriously, for every patient, regardless of who they are or what they think of me." The words hit James harder than any physical pain. As they prepared him for surgery, he watched Dr. Thompson transform completely into his professional role. The doctor was now wearing surgical scrubs, directing his team with authority and expertise. "Okay, people, let's move," Dr. Thompson commanded. "This is SSTEMI, and we're already pushing our door-to-balloon time. I want everyone ready in 5 minutes." As the anesthesia began to take effect, James' last conscious thought was of how terribly wrong he had been. The man he had judged so harshly based on his skin color was now preparing to literally hold his life in his hands. The operating room doors swung open, and the surgical team wheeled James in, with Dr. Thompson following, now fully scrubbed and ready to perform the delicate procedure that would save the life of the man who had shown him nothing but prejudice and disrespect. The operating room buzzed with focused energy as Dr. Thompson and his team worked to save James's life. The bright surgical lights illuminated the room as nurses and assistants moved with practiced precision, responding to Dr. Thompson's calm, clear commands. "Blockage confirmed in the right coronary artery," Dr. Thompson announced, his eyes fixed on the monitor showing James's heart. "Beginning stent placement now." His hands moved with incredible skill as he guided the thin catheter through James's blood vessels. The same hands that James had looked at with such prejudice just hours ago were now carefully threading a life-saving stent into his heart. The operating room staff watched in admiration as Dr. Thompson performed the delicate procedure with his usual expertise. "BP is stabilizing," a nurse reported. "Heart rate returning to normal range." Dr. Thompson nodded, his focus unwavering. "Good. Let's maintain this course." He had performed this procedure hundreds of times before, but he gave it the same careful attention he always did. Despite James's earlier behavior, Dr. Thompson was giving him the exact same high level of care he gave all his patients. 2 hours later, the surgery was complete. Dr. Thompson stepped back from the operating table, removing his surgical mask. "Excellent work, everyone," he said to his team. "He's stable. Let's get him to recovery." As the nurses wheeled James to the recovery room, Dr. Thompson went to update James's emergency contact, his sister Sarah, who had arrived during the surgery. She sat anxiously in the waiting room, clutching her purse. "Ms. Miller." Dr. Thompson approached her. "I'm Dr. Thompson. I performed your brother's surgery." Sarah stood up quickly. "How is he? Is James okay?" "The surgery was successful," Dr. Thompson explained kindly. "We placed a stent to open the blocked artery. He's stable now and being moved to recovery. He should wake up in a few hours." Sarah burst into tears of relief. "Thank you, doctor. Thank you so much." She hesitated for a moment before adding, "The nurse told me. She said you were actually his taxi passenger when it happened." Dr. Thompson nodded. Yes, I was. It was fortunate I was there when the symptoms started. What Dr. Thompson didn't mention was how James had treated him during that taxi ride. That wasn't important now. What mattered was that his patient was recovering. Several hours later, James slowly opened his eyes in the recovery room. The first thing he saw was the concerned face of his sister, Sarah. As his vision cleared, he noticed Dr. Thompson standing at the foot of his bed, reviewing his charts. "Welcome back, Mr. Miller," Dr. Thompson said professionally. "How are you feeling?" James tried to speak, but his throat was dry. Sarah helped him with a small sip of water. The memories of the taxi ride came flooding back. Every cruel word, every racist assumption he had made about the man who had just saved his life. Tears began rolling down James's cheeks. "Dr. Thompson," he managed to say, his voice weak and shaky. I don't deserve." Dr. Thompson moved closer to the bed. "Right now, you don't need to think about anything except getting better," he said firmly but kindly. "Your heart has been through a serious event. You need rest and recovery." Sarah looked confused at her brother's emotional reaction, not knowing about the taxi ride events. She just saw a caring doctor who had saved her brother's life. "Your vital signs are improving," Dr. Thompson continued, maintaining his professional demeanor. "We'll keep you here for a few days to monitor your recovery. Then we'll talk about lifestyle changes and cardiac rehabilitation." James couldn't stop crying. The contrast between his behavior and Dr. Thompson's professional care was overwhelming. Here was a man he had judged so harshly based only on his skin color, yet when James' life hung in the balance, Dr. Thompson had acted with nothing but skill, dedication, and compassion. Dr. Thompson checked James's IV and heart monitor one more time. "Try to get some rest, Mr. Miller. I'll check on you again in a few hours." He turned to leave the room, his white coat crisp and professional, his stethoscope around his neck, every inch the accomplished physician James had failed to see earlier. As Dr. Thompson walked out, James realized that this wasn't just about surviving a heart attack. This was about his heart being changed in a completely different way. 3 days had passed since James's heart surgery. He sat in his hospital bed, watching the morning sunlight stream through the window. The TV was on, but he wasn't really watching it. His mind kept replaying the taxi ride and everything that had happened since. Every time a nurse or doctor came to check on him, James noticed something he had been blind to before. The hospital staff was diverse. People of different races and backgrounds working together seamlessly. He saw their professionalism, their skills, and their dedication. How had he been so prejudiced before? "Good morning, Mr. Miller," Dr. Thompson said as he entered the room for his morning rounds. He was accompanied by 2 medical students, one Asian and one African American. "How are you feeling today?" "Better, doctor," James replied quietly. He had barely been able to look Dr. Thompson in the eye since waking up after surgery. The shame was still too fresh, too powerful. Dr. Thompson checked James's vital signs and reviewed his charts. "Your recovery is progressing well," he explained. "These are Dr. Chen and Dr. Washington. They're part of our cardiology team." He gestured to the medical students, who nodded professionally. James watched as Dr. Thompson taught the students, explaining the procedure he had performed and the recovery process. His expertise was obvious, his knowledge impressive. The students took notes eagerly, clearly respecting and admiring their teacher. After the students left, James finally gathered his courage. "Dr. Thompson," he said, his voice shaking slightly. Could I talk to you for a moment?" Dr. Thompson pulled up a chair next to the bed. His face was neutral, professional, but his eyes were kind. "Of course, Mr. Miller. What's on your mind?" James took a deep breath. "I need to apologize," he said, tears forming in his eyes. "The way I treated you in the taxi, the things I said, I was so wrong, so terribly wrong." Dr. Thompson listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. "I've been lying here for 3 days," James continued, wiping his eyes. "Thinking about everything. About how I've lived my life, about the assumptions I've made about people, about how the man I disrespected because of his skin color turned out to be the one who saved my life." A nurse came in to check James's IV, and he noticed for the first time that she was wearing a hijab. She worked efficiently, checking his medications with obvious competence. Just a week ago, he might have made assumptions about her too. Now he just saw a skilled healthcare worker doing her job. You know, Mr. Miller, Dr. Thompson finally spoke. In my 20 years as a doctor, I treated thousands of patients. Rich, poor, all races, all backgrounds. And do you know what I've learned? He paused, making sure James was listening. Hearts all look the same on the inside. When I'm operating, I can't tell if the heart belongs to a CEO or a janitor, a saint or a sinner. My job is to heal, regardless of who the patient is. James nodded, tears flowing freely now. I want to change, doctor. I need to change. This experience, it's opened my eyes, but I don't know where to start. Recognizing the need for change is the first step, Dr. Thompson said wisely. And it's often the hardest one. The fact that you're willing to acknowledge your prejudices and want to do better, that's significant. Just then, James's sister Sarah arrived with some fresh clothes. She noticed the serious conversation and stopped at the door, but Dr. Thompson stood up to leave anyway. Your physical heart is healing well, Mr. Miller, Dr. Thompson said, moving toward the door. It seems your spiritual heart is beginning to heal too. He smiled slightly. We'll talk more about your recovery plan this afternoon. As Dr. Thompson left the room, James turned to his sister. Sarah, he said quietly, I have a lot to tell you about what happened that night, and about the kind of person I want to become. Through the window, you could see Dr. Thompson walking down the hallway, stopping to chat with various staff members, respected and admired by everyone around him. James realized that his heart attack hadn't just been a medical emergency. It had been a wake-up call in more ways than one. A week after his surgery, James was preparing to leave the hospital. He sat on the edge of his bed, dressed in regular clothes for the first time since the incident. His sister Sarah was there to take him home, filling out the discharge paperwork. During his stay, James had watched everything around him with new eyes. He noticed how the African-American nurse always remembered his favorite juice at breakfast, how the Hispanic cleaning staff kept his room spotless, and how the Indian doctor from the night shift always took time to explain things clearly. Okay, Mr. Miller, Dr. Thompson said, entering the room with discharge papers. Before you leave, we need to discuss your recovery plan and lifestyle changes. He pulled up a chair, just as he had done every day during James's stay. James nodded, listening carefully as Dr. Thompson explained about diet, exercise, and medications. But something else was weighing on his mind. Dr. Thompson, James interrupted softly. Before we go through all this, I need to say something important. He straightened up in his bed, gathering his courage. I've been thinking a lot about making amends, about doing something real to show I've changed. Sarah watched curiously. Her brother had told her everything about that taxi ride, and she had been shocked by his behavior but proud of his desire to change. I've been driving taxis for 23 years, James continued, and I'm ashamed to admit that what happened that night, well, it wasn't the first time I judged someone by their skin color. His voice shook slightly, but it will be the last. Dr. Thompson listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. I want to speak to the taxi company, to all the drivers, James explained. Share my story. Maybe if they hear what happened to me, how my prejudices nearly cost me my life, and how the man I disrespected turned out to be the one who saved me, maybe it could make a difference. That's a brave decision, Dr. Thompson replied. Change often starts with one person willing to speak up. James nodded, wiping his eyes. And there's something else. I want to volunteer here at the hospital. Maybe work with patients who need rides to their appointments. I know it's not much, but... Actually, Dr. Thompson interrupted. We have a program that provides transportation assistance to patients who can't afford it. Having someone with your driving experience would be valuable. Sarah squeezed her brother's hand proudly. The change in him over the past week had been remarkable. Dr. Thompson, James said, his voice stronger now. Would you be willing to come speak to the taxi drivers with me? Share your side of the story? I think they need to hear both perspectives. Dr. Thompson considered this for a moment. He dealt with prejudice regularly in his life, but here was an opportunity to create real change. Yes, he finally said, I think that could be very powerful. James smiled with relief. Thank you, doctor. Not just for saving my life, but for showing me how wrong I was. How wrong I've been for so many years. You know, Mr. Miller, Dr. Thompson said, standing up. In medicine, we often say that prevention is better than cure. Maybe what you're proposing could prevent others from making the same mistakes. As they went through the discharge paperwork, a young African-American man in a wheelchair was brought in by a nurse. He would be taking James's bed next. A week ago, James might have requested a different room. Now, he smiled warmly at his replacement and wished him well. Remember? Dr. Thompson said as James prepared to leave, physical recovery is important, but the changes you're making in your heart and mind, those are just as crucial. James stood up carefully, still a bit weak but stronger every day. I won't let you down, Doctor. Not after everything you've taught me, both about health and about humanity. As Sarah wheeled him toward the elevator, James looked back at his room, at Dr. Thompson standing there in his white coat. He realized that while the stent in his heart was keeping him alive, it was the lesson he'd learned that would help him truly live. The hospital doors opened to a bright morning, and James stepped out into the sunlight, ready to begin his journey not just as a heart attack survivor, but as a changed man. 6 months had passed since that life-changing night in the taxi. The community center's meeting room was packed with taxi drivers, hospital staff, and local community members. James stood at the podium, his hands slightly shaking as he adjusted the microphone. Most of you know me, James began, looking at his fellow taxi drivers. I've been driving these streets for over 20 years, but 6 months ago, something happened that completely changed my life. He glanced at Dr. Thompson, who sat in the front row, offering an encouraging nod. The room was quiet as James told his story. He didn't hold anything back. He described his racist behavior that night, the cruel comments he had made, and how the man he had judged so harshly turned out to be the one who saved his life. I thought I knew people, James continued, his voice emotional. I thought I could judge them by their skin color, by how they looked. I was so wrong. He pulled out a small piece of paper from his pocket, his latest hospital volunteer schedule. In the audience, Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. Next to her sat Abdul, a taxi driver who had been inspired by James's story to start his own anti-discrimination initiative among night shift drivers. Since that night, James said, I've given over 200 free rides to patients who needed help getting to their medical appointments. Every person I've driven has taught me something new, their stories, their lives, they'd shown me how blind I was before. Dr. Thompson stood up next, walking to the podium as James stepped aside. The audience applauded. Many knew him now, not just as a respected doctor, but as someone who had turned a moment of prejudice into an opportunity for change. When I first met James, Dr. Thompson began, he saw only my skin color. Today, we work together to help others. Change is possible, but it requires us to open our hearts and minds. The presentation continued with stories from other drivers who had been inspired to confront their own prejudices. A young Hispanic nurse shared how patient care had improved since the hospital started working with the reformed taxi service. After the formal meeting, people gathered in small groups, sharing experiences and ideas. James stood with a group of new taxi drivers, explaining the importance of treating every passenger with respect. You never know who's sitting in your backseat, he told them, but more importantly, it shouldn't matter. Every person deserves respect. Dr. Thompson approached James with a smile. The program's really making a difference, he said. Hospital administration says complaints about transportation discrimination have dropped by 60% since we started. James nodded proudly. His taxi now displayed a special sticker, Safe Rides for All, part of the new initiative he had helped create. His regular customers had noticed the change in him, and many had become advocates themselves. Next month, James told Dr. Thompson, we're expanding the program to include evening hospital shifts. 3 more taxi companies want to join. He patted his chest where the stent remained, a constant reminder of that night. Who would have thought a heart attack could lead to all this? As the meeting wound down, a young black medical student approached James. Sir, she said, I heard your story last month during my hospital rotation. It inspired me to start a similar program at my university. James smiled warmly. 6 months ago, he might have dismissed her. Now, he saw a future doctor, a leader, a person making a difference. The community center slowly emptied, but the impact of the evening would ripple outward. James's story had become more than just a tale of personal transformation. It was now a catalyst for community change. Outside, the Boston evening was cool and clear. James and Dr. Thompson stood in the parking lot, looking at the city lights. Thank you, James said quietly, for giving me not just a second chance at life, but a chance to be a better person. Dr. Thompson smiled. You did the hard work yourself, James. You chose to change. As they parted ways, the doctor heading back to his evening hospital rounds, the taxi driver ready to start his shift, both men knew that their unexpected encounter had created something meaningful. James got into his taxi, adjusted his mirror, and saw his own reflection, the same face, but with different eyes, a different heart, and a new purpose. As he pulled away from the curb, his Safe Rides for All sticker caught the streetlight, a bright reminder that change was possible, one person, one ride, one heart at a time.